So value-based pricing is this fluffy term that is being thrown around to essentially, it means something like, well, if the customer is willing to pay X, you should charge X. Okay, great. But in my book, there is more to it than that. One of the simpler ways to explain at least parts of it is to use the model of a value chain. So I had this Dutch client, and they had a piece of recruitment software that they were selling to like the Manpower Group and different others. And they had first gone into the market with it where they had like a price per recruiter. So the recruiter is essentially a user in the software. They would have a license for it, they would use the software, they would run different sort of recruitment processes, process candidates, and fill positions. Great. Except that they didn't have a lot of traction with the software. So we then did a project, and essentially we reorganized the pricing model around the software, and then we changed the pricing model from a seat-based model, sort of price per recruiter, to a model where we say, well, we are going to price per candidate touched, meaning that they could process a candidate through the system, and whenever we enriched a candidate with more data, which was essentially what the software did, it collected and compiled more data onto a candidate profile to make them more eligible for work, essentially, which would then increase the rate at which they were hired, which would then increase the revenue for the Manpower Group and other recruiters, right? So we said, well, whenever we are improving the profile of a candidate, then we're counting it as a touch, and then we're going to price the number of touches. So whenever we have increased data, that is now value generated. That went swell, and the project is alive and well, and they're making a lot of money on it, and that's great. Okay, so if we want to break something like this down to, well, what is going on and how are we sort of value basing this new price, we can say, well, if you think of the value chain that the recruiter has, it's something like, I'm doing a process and I need to hire a recruiter to sort of sit at the start of that process. That's how I begin. And then the recruiter does a lot of things, and then we improve the data quality on our candidates, right? And then they get hired, and then they, end up earning us money as a recruiting company. Okay, great. So we have a sequence of events, like first we do this, then this happens, then this happens, and then this can happen, then we make money, right? So that's a value chain, meaning that I invest something, costs, effort, friction, and so forth at the beginning, and then through a process, I earn money. There's a profit. If it's, if the value chain works, then I get more out of it than I put into it. That's the idea, right? So let's run the following thought experiment. Let's say that the process that we're proposing to the recruiter is they already, through the cost of the recruiter and salaries and so forth, have to put in 100 units of cost, like $100 or something. And then they get $200 of value out of it, right? So in terms of increased revenues from like better candidate data and so forth. So we have like 100% ROI, like we double our money. So whenever we spend 100 on the recruiter and the process, we get 200 out. That's great. So if our software is enabling this process, if we're saying, well, we're the ones that are making this possible, and we think that we can price it 50, let's say half the value, right? So 100 of value is being generated, and we think we're worth half, right? Okay, if we then say, and we want to then increase the price of the recruiter by 50, so that's half. So instead of it now costing us 100 to get started, and we get 200 out, we now increase, because we're adding a seat-based license here, we say, well, the recruiter, whatever cost you have, we're adding to that. So we're going to make it more expensive to begin the value generating process for you, right? So what happens here is that from an ROI and a value creation perspective, the recruiter now has to say, well, okay, so I now have a process because of your pricing that costs me 150 to begin, and I get 200 out. So like without your pricing, I had 100 in ROI, I doubled my money. But with your pricing, I have 33, right? So I get 50 more out on a base of 150, right? So I get a third more, like not bad, but fair enough. When we take the 50 in pricing, we say, okay, we're gonna load it off the recruiter, and then we're gonna go to the end of the value chain. and then we're going to load it on the last point in the value chain that we can find, which we can reliably measure and so forth. And that was actually the candidate's touched. And then we load it on there and say, hey, we're going to charge sort of a price per candidate touched, which is going to cost you overall 50 to run this. Now the math changes, because what's happening psychologically with the recruiter is they're saying, okay, so I have this value chain and it costs me now 100 to start, and now I get 150 out. Because now our pricing is actually it's sort of taken off the top. So instead of getting the 200 out, like I get the 200 minus your price, which is 150. And what is the ROI? Well, it's 15%. I put 100 in, I get 150 out. It's the same numbers. So the first way that we priced, when we loaded the front end, the first link in the value chain, the user, the seat, the recruiter, we would have an ROI of a process of 33. But if we take and move the pricing back in the chain to the exit point, to the value generation point, just text the value, we're just lowering the total value that they get out, but the investment is not any more expensive, then the ROI actually increases even though it's the same numbers. So what will happen with a process like this is that it's a better ROI, it's a better deal for the client, which means that they will now invest more in it. Let's do this example. Let's say that the customer reinvests all value into the value chain. So they invest 100 and they get 150 out. And then they invest 150, so they get 225 out. And they invest 225 and they get 337 out, and so forth, right? So that is the expansion rate that's going to happen in the customer, which means that you grow a lot faster. But let's do the other version where you have the front-loaded pricing model, where they invest, now they have to invest 150, so the minimum ticket size just went up, and then they get 200 out. And then they invest 200 in, they only get 267 out. And then they invest 267 in, and then get whatever it is, 367 out. So you'll see that the rate of growth and the rate of expansion in the front-loaded model is way lower. So the barrier to entry is higher because the cost of starting my value chain is higher, but the expansion rate inside the value chain is also lower if we're using this sort of reinvestment model, which means that customers are just gonna buy less to begin with and then buy less over time, because it's just not that good an ROI if I want to spend my money here, as compared to a backloaded model where we take and price the end of the value chain, or the outcome, or the output of the value chain. So yes, value-based pricing can be measured in terms of what the customer is willing to pay. But really, if you think about value-based pricing, you should usually think about it in the sense of outcome-based pricing, where you say, well, can we find the value chain, figure out what the net value is that is being generated by sort of a price-free process, and then we can sort of tax that to the best extent. And then we can figure out what is a fair tax rate. Can we actually charge half, or should we only charge, let's say, 10% of the value generated? Maybe that's more fair, and so forth. But I think that is a much more fruitful and operationally viable way for you to think about value-based pricing, because it actually gives you a framework to analyze it within that is useful for both you and your customer. Hey there! So I create these videos for free so that you can take your great SaaS product and turn it into a great SaaS business. So if you like the video and you got value from it, you should of course subscribe to the channel, and also tell a friend. So write someone and say, hey, you're in SaaS, this guy talks about SaaS, maybe there's something in there for you. So that is the only way that this channel actually grows, or these videos gets around. And this is sort of how I try to provide value to everyone. I have a network of clients that I have, and I get most of my business from referrals only. So the reason I make the videos and write the books and so forth is actually to just provide value to everyone else, because I can only be in one place at a time. So my hope with all these videos is just to do more good in the world. And if you tell a friend or you share, you can help me do that. So thank you.